Most of the best-known serial killers and wicked murderers are men. We only have to Google the word serial killer before a list of male killers appears. Bundy, Fish, Kemper, but little do we know that although there are less female serial killers, they can just be as stone-cold, heartless, and especially gruesome. Yes, it is a well-known trope that women kill with poison and men with their fists. And although it does seem that women have a preference for little bottles with skulled labels, as we will see in this documentary, they love a massacre as much as their male counterparts. History is full of violent women. We can read of women fighting in ancient times with no less ferocity than men. Dynamis of Bosphorus, for instance, living in what is present-day Turkey, starved her husband and king to death so she could take his throne and kingdom. Think of Cersei Lannister, but then Turkish. Or think of Mary Tudor, who became Mary I and soon got her nickname Bloody Mary because of her bloodthirst against Protestants. And the list goes on. What I'm trying to say is that we have a massive misconception when it comes to female serial killers. It seems as if bloodthirsty women are rare creatures, perpetuated by popular media and of course the press. This is the first part of Killer Women, a documentary about lesser-known tales of gruesome, deadly women throughout time. Sit back and relax. Sarah Morgan and Sarah Morgan Metyard. Being a milliner, a hat maker in 18th century London was an impressive feat for two women. Sarah and her daughter, also named Sarah, had a little shop on Hanover Square, a beautiful and upscale green square just off the beating heart of shopping, Oxford Street. They were doing good for themselves, and so they took in no less than 5 apprentice girls. They were to learn how to make hats and, in time, become milliners themselves. One of these girls was Anne Naylor. She travelled to Hanover Square with her sister. Anne was not the most healthy girl, which was quite common in a time where penicillin was not yet invented. The fact that Anne always seemed to have a cough or was never really strong enough to lift the rolls of fabric infuriated Mother Sarah. She hated lazy girls. She grew cold and cruel to the girl, so much even that the poor girl tried to run away. Anne was caught not long after and dragged to the attic, where she was imprisoned and had to survive on scraps of stale and mouldy bread and little bits of water. When she tried to escape again, daughter Sarah captured the poor girl and took her firmly by the throat. Too weak to resist, Anne was dragged harshly by the throat back to the house and back into the attic. But it started to get worse. Mother Sarah beat the ill girl with a broomstick while her daughter held Anne down. And then the woman proceeded to tie a rope around poor Anne's waist with both her hands tied firmly behind her back. Mother and daughter attached the length of her rope to the attic door and made it impossible for Anne to lie down or even sit. The girl was left like this for 3 days and died on the 4th. Sarah and Sarah pretended to the other girls that Anne was fine, and long after the girl had died, the women were seen bringing food up to the attic as if nothing happened. But bodies began to rot, and when Anne's corpse began to stink, they put the body in a trunk to mask the odor. But even a trunk will not stop the decaying girl to smell, and thus Sarah and Sarah began dismembering the poor girl, wrapping the parts up in cloths. The body and the head went in one big wrap, and the legs and the arms in another. They then disposed of it in the sewers around the city. When parts of the dismembered girl were discovered and brought to the attention of the authorities, the police concluded that the parts must have come from a surgeon's office, used for dissection, and they dismissed the investigation. But what about Anne's sister, who came with her to become an apprentice at the milliner's shop? Right. Well, she was convinced that her sister had been murdered and mentioned this to a lodger in the house. And when the lodger mentioned the conversation he had with Anne's sister, mother and daughter murdered the girl in the same cruel and heartless manner. But it seemed that there were problems between mother and daughter, as Sarah, the daughter, confided in another lodger that she was abused and mistreated by her cruel mother. The lodger was able to convince the girl to go to the police and said that she would be excused of any crime because of the way her mother treated her. And although Sarah was first too scared to go to the police, she did take the first step after she had to suffer under even more abuse by her mother. She confessed everything, and both women were then arrested and stood trial at the Old Bailey. On July 19th, both women were hung at Tyburn for the cruel murders of parish apprentice. Darya Saltykov. Darya Saltykov lived in 18th century Russia. History buffs will know that when it comes to cruelty, there were numerous precedents in how the Tsar would treat their staff and servants. Darya was married to a very wealthy man of the Russian Saltykov family. It was an arranged marriage, and Darya was very young when she had to swear in front of God that she would stay with this man for the rest of her life. Darya had already been blessed by 2 boys by the time she was 26, and although she was widowed, her husband had left her a big estate where she lived with her 2 sons and their servants. Darya was known as a cruel woman, and she would treat her female servants with extreme sadism and cruelty. Girls began to disappear on the estate, and their families became worried. After they did not hear of their loved ones, they went to the police. If it were only this simple. Darya belonged to a rich and powerful family, and had friends at the Russian royal court. The accusations made by the families were disregarded, and the police dropped the case. Even more, the families of the girls that disappeared were penalized every time they would go to the police regarding their daughters, sisters, and mothers disappearing at the estate. At long last, the families bound their efforts together and started a petition. They presented this petition to the Empress Katerina II. Due to the circumstances and the fact that more and more women had gone missing, the Empress was unable to ignore the petition, and she commanded the police to start an investigation into the disappearance of these girls. Due to the fact that the number of disappeared women was so incredibly large, the investigation took no less than 6 years. During the investigation, Darya was held in custody. There were many witnesses, and the police took the time to interrogate every single one of them. They studied the case into the smallest detail and went through all the records of Darya's estate. At the end of the investigation, the authorities counted as many as 138 questionable deaths, most of them through torture. Only 38 of these deaths could be ascribed to Darya, even though the police was pretty sure that Darya committed about 100 more murders. With the death penalty abolished in Russia in 1754, Katerina II had no idea what to do with Darya or how to punish her. The Empress wanted to punish Darya in a very special way to show people that ill treatment of the nobles towards their servants was not tolerated. Darya was chained into a chair on a big public square with a plaque around her neck. This woman tortured and murdered. She was held there for 4 days and nights, and people from all over the region came to look at her. She was later imprisoned in the Ivanovsky convent, but this seemed quite a nice way to be imprisoned, and so the court decided that Darya was to be put into a dark dungeon cell, tied to the wall by chains. After 11 years in a dark, draughty dungeon, she was taken to the convent again, where she had a simple cell with a window. Her behavior was recorded, and it is so that we know that Darya would spit at curious people that came to have a look at her. She would die at the age of 71 in the same small cell after 33 years of being imprisoned. Manette Bonhours. Although the French Revolution has been known as a period of social unrest, cruelty, and clean-cut murder, Manette Bonhours had no game in beheading nobility or deposing the king. This female serial killer was young, beautiful, and shrewd. As a young woman, she fell in love with a handsome man to whom she gave herself with heart and soul, something which was considered improper at the time. When the man packed his things and left her without a wedding ring around her finger, Manette developed a strong hatred against men. Manette decided to dress up like a man, not hiding the fact that she was a woman. and she began visiting fashionable clubs and bars in the Parisian streets. It was not long before the men of Paris became utterly fascinated by her and her ways. Manette would always have a hotel room booked in advance, to which she would invite whichever man she wanted. In this room, she would feed him alcohol that was mixed with a strong sedative. Once the men were unconscious, she would finish them off with a blow from a hammer. Probably not the finishing they had imagined when following the minx into the hotel room. Even though she was well known in the Parisian bars and clubs, the Paris police was puzzled. All these murders seemed to be random killings. There was no motive, no purpose. When they launched their investigation, more and more men started to talk of a beautiful Parisian girl that would prowl the bars and the clubs dressed in men's clothes. She would be seen with men that were later found murdered in hotel rooms. The police sent out undercover agents to these bars in an attempt to discover who this illustrious woman was. One detective pretended to be drunk and accepted Manette's invitation to go back with her to the hotel. When she slipped him a glass of alcohol mixed with a sedative, things started to click. He knew what kind of game she was playing, and he decided to act as if she was passed out. Manette came onto him with her bludgeoning hammer, and as he saw her, the man jumped up from the bed and disarmed the woman. In 1808, on the 16th of May, Manette had both her hands strapped behind her back, while her beautiful long blonde hair was cut off completely. She laid her head in the little dent of the guillotine while thousands of people crowded together on the square. Her last words were, "Don't you think it's a pity to cut off a head as pretty as mine?" Maria Swanenburg. The Dutch student city of Leiden was not always as nice and as safe as it seems to be today. In 1839, Maria Swanenburg was born. 29 years later, she would marry Johannes van der Linde and have no less than 5 sons and 2 daughters with the man. In the city, she was known as Goeie Mie, which means as much as Good Maria or Kind-Hearted Mary. She deserved this nickname as she spent her time nursing ill people and children in the poorhouses. Some 20 years later, after she got married in 1883, an investigation into Maria Swanenburg was opened. She was thought to have poisoned the Groothuizen family. The investigation that had been opened went deep. There were more than 100 suspicious deaths, including Maria's parents, who were found dead in their home in 1880. She had taken out insurance on her father and mother just before killing her parents, and it was always believed that her mother might have been her very first victim. She has tried to kill more than 80 people through slipping arsenic in their food or drink. More than 27 people died in 3 years between 1880 and 1883. Another 50 people were found badly wounded and had to be cared for the rest of their remaining life due to arsenic poisoning. Maria's motive would always be money. Before she killed people, she would take insurances out on their lives just before she started putting small doses of poison into their food and drink. Maria was sentenced to life in prison, and she died in prison in 1915. Dagmar Overbye. Dagmar Overbye was a Danish woman living in turn of the 20th century Copenhagen. To the rest of the world, Dagmar seemed to be a great woman. She helped mothers to find a home for their illegitimate children. She would ask a one-time fee from the mothers and promise them to find their kids an amazing home. But nothing was less true. In fact, instead of finding the kids a warm home, she would strangle or drown the babies before disposing the little corpses in her kitchen stove. Caroline Agesen, a young mother looking for a new and loving family for her newly born daughter, placed an ad in the paper. Dagmar answered to this ad and said that she would be able to find the kid an amazing new home. And for this service, she would ask a fee of 200 kroner. This was a small fortune in the 1920s, but the mother paid happily. Everything was set, and Caroline handed over her daughter to Dagmar, who that night proceeded to strangle the baby and burn its little corpse. The next day, Caroline knocked on Dagmar's door, asking for her kid back, but Dagmar said that she could not recall the address of the family where she left the little baby. Caroline, now heartbroken, went to the police and hoped to get her little girl back in this way. But when the police searched Dagmar's little apartment in the Vesterbro district, they discovered baby bones and skulls. The woman was arrested and confessed to killing at least 16 babies in her stove. Dagmar, now the most talked of woman in Danish history, was sentenced to death, and this sentence was later changed to a life sentence. She died at the age of 42 in 1929 and was found guilty of at least 9 baby murders, but authorities think that the true number was closer to 30. The trial and the gruesome murders that happened here caused the Danish laws on childcare to change in favor of protecting kids. So this was the first part of the Killer Woman documentary. I really hope you enjoyed it. Keep your eyes open for the second one and subscribe so you surely do not miss it. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and please leave a comment on what killer woman you would love to see in the next part of the documentary.